The morning after Arabella Street Claire's wedding should have been filled with smiles and whispered promises at dawn. Instead, the sunlight streaming through the heavy curtains of Hawthorne Manor illuminated the pale face of her husband, the Duke of Greystone, slumped in a velvet armchair. Dead. The golden glint of the wedding band on his finger seemed to mock her. Arabella, newlywed and now a widowed duchess, stared at the scene as if it were a nightmare. But nightmares didn't come with servants whispering about poison and suspicious glances. Arabella had never wanted to marry the Duke. At 23, with her wavy brown hair always a bit too loose for societal standards, and a spirit that often led her to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, she was far from the most sought-after debutante in London. But her mother, determined to see her daughter with a title, had accepted the Duke of Greystone's proposal with the same enthusiasm as someone finding an empty seat in Hyde Park during the social season. The Duke, a 37-year-old widower, reserved and mysterious, had a reputation as impeccable as his estates, or so it seemed. "He's dead." Arabella's voice trembled as the housekeeper stared at her, horrified. "He is dead, isn't he?" The housekeeper, a stout woman with hardened features, merely nodded. Arabella took a step back, as if she could escape the truth. A dead duke the morning after their wedding? This would not go unnoticed in society. Not that Arabella cared much for the whispers of ladies in ballroom corners. What truly worried her was that all eyes, including those of the new heir, were now on her. And the new heir, Thomas Hawthorne, the Duke's younger brother, was not known for his kindness. Thomas, with his commanding presence and dark brown eyes brimming with intensity and suspicion, entered the room where his brother's body still lay. He looked at Arabella as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. "A tragedy, don't you think, Lady Greystone?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Arabella shiver. "Undoubtedly, Mr. Hawthorne, an inexplicable tragedy." She tried to sound confident, but her voice faltered, betraying the whirlwind of emotions within her. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to his brother's body, his gaze laden with something between grief and cold detachment, analyzing every detail. Finally, he turned, fixing his stare on Arabella. "I understand this situation is difficult for you." He paused, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "However, I must ask, what happened last night?" Arabella blinked, startled. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Not yet." His reply was as sharp and cutting as a blade. Arabella knew she had no choice. She needed to explain what she knew, or more accurately, what she didn't know. The marriage had been a formality. Vows exchanged under watchful eyes, obligatory dances, and a night that ended with the Duke retreating to his study while Arabella remained alone in her room, reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a few hours. Now, with the Duke's body before her, the memory of that night felt almost surreal. She hadn't seen Benedict since the moment he murmured a hurried farewell at the end of the banquet. "Business," he had said. What did that mean now? "I haven't seen him since last night when he went to his study," Arabella finally replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. Thomas remained silent for a moment, his gaze so piercing that Arabella felt as though he were reading her thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his tone controlled but tinged with disbelief. "How convenient." Arabella felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, a servant entered, carrying a tray with a small crystal bottle. "This was on the Duke's desk," he announced, placing the item on the mantelpiece. All eyes turned to the bottle. Small, elegant, and nearly empty, it seemed innocuous. Yet Thomas's expression hardened, and Arabella realized the situation was about to worsen. Something told her that bottle, with its glistening amber liquid, would become the centerpiece of a scandal that would shake not just Greystone Manor, but all of society. And Arabella, whether she liked it or not, was at the heart of it all. Arabella gazed at the small crystal bottle with a growing sense of dread. It was impossible to ignore what it meant. Someone had poisoned the Duke of Greystone. The question lingering in the air was simple yet deadly. Who? And perhaps more importantly, why? Thomas Hawthorne picked up the bottle, holding it firmly between his fingers, as if it might reveal its secrets by touch alone. His dark brown eyes were somber, fixed on Arabella as though every movement she made was a piece of a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, his voice as cold as the marble mantelpiece where the bottle had rested. Arabella took a step back, raising her hands defensively. "I've never seen that before, and honestly, I have no idea why you'd think I would." "Because most newlywed women don't lose their husbands on their wedding night, Lady Greystone," he replied, his tone dry and nearly cruel. She felt the impact of his words like a slap. Yes, she knew how it looked. A young woman, untitled until the day before, married to a powerful duke, and within less than 24 hours, he was dead. It was enough to set any ballroom alight with gossip. "If you're suggesting I poisoned my husband, I'd advise you to tread carefully with your accusations, Mr. Hawthorne." Arabella shot back, her voice steadier than she felt. Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by her resolve for the first time. Yet before he could respond, a servant entered the room, hesitating. "Mr. Hawthorne, the coroner has arrived. He wishes to examine the body." The silence that followed was suffocating. Arabella felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The coroner. The word felt like the prelude to a tragedy. "Very well," Thomas finally said, his gaze never leaving Arabella. "I hope the truth is on your side, Lady Greystone. Because if it isn't, society will have its villain before the end of season ball even begins." Arabella wanted to scream, to protest, to demand that he stop looking at her as though she were a criminal. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, silent. The coroner, a thin man with a grave expression, entered moments later. He greeted Thomas and Arabella with a curt nod before approaching the Duke's body. As he worked, the room was filled only with the sound of footsteps and the hushed whispers of the servants. When the coroner finally straightened, he was holding something in his hands. A small glass vial he had found in the inner pocket of the Duke's coat. "This was with him," the coroner announced, handing the vial to Thomas. Arabella held her breath as Thomas examined the item. It resembled the crystal bottle but was smaller, as though it had been used to carry the fatal liquid. "It seems we're dealing with more than an unfortunate accident," Thomas said, his gaze darkening. Arabella could take no more. And what does that prove? That he was poisoned? And if he was, how does that implicate me? Thomas crossed his arms, seeming to weigh his words. "We don't yet know who's behind this, Lady Greystone. But I can assure you, we will find out." Arabella felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just the suspicion hanging over her. It was Thomas's penetrating, mistrustful gaze that made her feel as though he had already decided her guilt. And yet, something about him intrigued her. Despite the accusation in his eyes, there was something else, a fierce determination to uncover the truth no matter where it led. As night fell over Greystone Manor, Arabella found herself alone in her quarters, staring into the darkness beyond the window. The image of Benedict, lifeless in his armchair, refused to leave her mind. She knew there was much more to this story, something that wasn't yet clear. And if she wanted to prove her innocence, she would have to uncover the truth before Thomas decided she wasn't worthy of the chance. That night, as the halls of Greystone echoed with silence and mystery, Arabella vowed to herself that she would do whatever it took to clear her name. But deep down, she knew this promise would place her in danger, and perhaps bring her even closer to Thomas Hawthorne. Arabella woke to the sound of insistent knocking on her door. Lady Briarwood, the housekeeper, entered hastily, her eyes filled with urgency. "Lady Greystone, rumors are beginning to spread. Lord Hawthorne has called a family council for this afternoon. He requests your presence." Arabella barely had time to react before the woman disappeared, leaving her with a whirlwind of thoughts. A family council? The idea was dreadful. They would certainly ask difficult questions, and Thomas's ever-watchful eyes would miss no flaw in her responses. Descending to the main hall, she found Thomas standing beside his cousin, Lady Vivian, a woman with vibrant red hair and a smile that seemed to conceal ulterior motives. Vivian regarded Arabella with the air of someone who had already passed judgment. "What a pity the happiness of your union was so short-lived, Lady Greystone," Vivian said with saccharine venom. Arabella maintained her composure despite the veiled insult. "Indeed, Lady Vivian. It's unfortunate that something so unexpected has shaken everyone." Thomas observed the exchange with a faint smile, as though curious to see who would emerge victorious in this battle of words. Before Arabella could add anything, he intervened. "Let's get to the point," Thomas said. "The council has been called to assess the situation and ensure no rash decisions are made regarding the circumstances of my brother's death." Arabella lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I trust your investigation also includes looking for other potential culprits. After all, the Duke had many dealings and allies. Surely someone else had something to gain from his death." Her statement made Thomas hesitate for a moment, but he quickly regained his impenetrable demeanor. "That is precisely what I intend to uncover." The family council was an uncomfortable spectacle. The Duke's relatives gathered in a candlelit room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open disdain for Arabella. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his commanding posture controlling the room. "My brother's will specifies that his widow is entitled to a considerable dowry and may remain at Greystone Hall until further arrangements are made," he began. "However, given the mystery surrounding his death, I believe a deeper investigation is necessary before any final decisions are reached." Arabella felt the blood rise to her face. She hadn't expected hospitality, but being treated like an intruder in her own home was more than she could bear. "I understand your position, Lord Hawthorne," she said, her voice steady. "But I trust your investigation will be fair and impartial. After all, if there's one thing my short time at Greystone has taught me, it's that this family is surrounded by secrets." Her comment left the room in an uneasy silence. Thomas narrowed his eyes, but before he could respond, Vivian leaned forward with a dangerous smile. "What a bold insinuation, Lady Greystone. Would we have something to hide?" Arabella didn't back down. "We all have something to hide, Lady Vivian. The question is, who has the most to lose?" After the meeting, Thomas found Arabella in the library, where she was unsuccessfully attempting to focus on a book. He entered unannounced, his presence filling the room with an unsettling intensity. "You enjoy making enemies, don't you?" he asked, his tone somewhere between amusement and exhaustion. "Only when necessary," Arabella replied, snapping the book shut. "What do you want now, Lord Hawthorne?" Thomas crossed his arms, leaning against a shelf. "You're right about the secrets in this family. There's more at stake here than you realize." "Then why not tell me what's being hidden?" Arabella challenged. Thomas hesitated, something in his eyes betraying an internal struggle. Finally, he stepped closer. "My brother wasn't the man everyone believed him to be. He had debts, enemies, and dangerous alliances. If you truly want to prove your innocence, Lady Greystone, you'll need to face truths that may shatter everything you thought you knew." Arabella felt a chill run down her spine, but held his gaze. "I have no other choice, Lord Hawthorne. Whatever is hidden, I'd rather confront it than live under this shadow." Thomas seemed impressed, his expression softening briefly. But he quickly returned to his usual unyielding demeanor. "Then prepare yourself, Lady Greystone. The truth in Greystone Hall rarely comes without a price." Arabella barely had time to process Thomas's words before she was swept into an atmosphere of growing tension. Greystone Hall, with its shadowed corridors and walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, seemed filled with whispers. Every glance from a servant, every cutting remark from Lady Vivian was a sharp dagger aimed at her. The following morning, Arabella decided to take action. If the Duke had secrets, and all evidence suggested he did, she needed to find them. She began with the library, where shelves crammed with books covered nearly every wall. Among dusty volumes and forgotten journals, she discovered a small hidden compartment in an ornate desk. Inside were letters. She read them avidly, her fingers trembling. The letters were written by a Lord Ashby, a name unfamiliar to her, but the words were threatening enough to make her shudder. Benedict, the late Duke, had apparently amassed a significant debt to this man and had failed to repay it. "Find something interesting?" Thomas's voice echoed in the room, making Arabella jump. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, one eyebrow raised. He seemed far too relaxed, considering the circumstances. "Perhaps," Arabella replied, clutching the letter to her chest. "It seems your brother owed money to a man named Lord Ashby." Thomas narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. "That doesn't surprise me. Ashby is known for, shall we say, questionable dealings." "You knew about this?" Arabella asked, her tone a mixture of anger and relief. "I knew Benedict was reckless, but I had no idea the extent of his troubles," he said, taking the letter from her hands. Arabella watched as he read it, his expression darkening with each line. She waited for him to finish, the silence between them heavy, like a storm about to break. "If Ashby is involved, this explains a lot," Thomas finally said, handing the letter back. "But it also complicates everything." Arabella crossed her arms. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if Ashby was pressuring Benedict, he could very well be responsible for my brother's death. But at the same time, he could easily use this to incriminate us, especially you." Arabella felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just her reputation at stake. Her safety was in jeopardy as well. She knew Thomas was right. A man like Lord Ashby would certainly have the means to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "So, what do we do?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We visit him," Thomas said, as if it were the most logical decision in the world. "What?" Arabella's eyes widened. "You want to confront him? That's not dangerous?" Thomas offered a small smile, determination gleaming in his eyes. "Dangerous? Certainly. But if you want to clear your name, we need answers." The next morning, Arabella and Thomas set out for Ashby's estate. The journey was long, and the silence between them was filled only by the clatter of the carriage wheels and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Arabella studied Thomas, trying to unravel the mystery of the man beside her. He was an enigma, a blend of strength and vulnerability that intrigued her more than she cared to admit. When they finally arrived, they were greeted by a butler who led them to the estate's grand sitting room. Lord Ashby sat in a leather armchair, a middle-aged man with shrewd eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach his lips. "Lord Hawthorne, what a surprise. And who is your charming companion?" Ashby said, rising to greet them. "My sister-in-law, Lady Greystone," Thomas replied, his tone carrying an undercurrent of warning. Arabella held her head high, even as Ashby's calculating gaze swept over her. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss," Ashby said with false sympathy. "Your brother was a singular man." "That's one way to put it," Thomas said coldly. "We're here because we found some of your letters among Benedict's belongings, letters suggesting he owed you a significant amount." Ashby smiled, but his eyes glinted with a hint of menace. "Ah, yes, Benedict and I had business. Unfortunately, he wasn't as reliable as I'd hoped." Arabella stepped forward, summoning courage from somewhere deep within. "And these business dealings, would they involve anything that led to his murder?" Ashby's smile vanished, and the silence that followed was deafening. Arabella felt Thomas's gaze on her, but she held her ground. She knew she had taken a risk by asking the question, but she also knew they couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. Finally, Ashby spoke, his voice low and threatening. "Lady Greystone, be careful with your accusations. In a game like this, anyone can become a pawn or a suspect. Arabella felt a chill run down her spine. As they left the estate, she couldn't tell whether they had made progress or simply plunged deeper into a dangerous game. But one thing was certain: Lord Ashby's name was now a central piece of the puzzle, and the truth was closer yet more terrifying than ever. The carriage rolled down the gravel road beneath a gray sky, leaving behind the imposing gates of Lord Ashby's estate. Arabella clasped her hands in her lap, her thoughts buzzing like a beehive. Every word exchanged in Ashby's drawing room felt like a veiled threat, a warning that she was dealing with forces far greater than she had imagined. Thomas, seated beside her, kept his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. His silence was as heavy as the sky, which threatened rain. Finally, he spoke. "That was bold of you, confronting him like that." Arabella turned to him, her indignation plain. "Someone had to, since you seemed more interested in tiptoeing around the issue." Thomas raised an eyebrow, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "And risking being thrown out or worse, not exactly a brilliant strategy." "Well, your friendly approach clearly wasn't working," Arabella shot back, crossing her arms. Thomas sighed, rubbing his temple. "Ashby isn't just dangerous, he's influential. If we push him too hard, he'll use it against us." Arabella hesitated. She knew Thomas was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Ashby knew more than he had admitted, and the only way to uncover the truth would be to force him to show his hand. When they arrived back at Greystone Hall, the mansion looked more foreboding than ever. The windows seemed like watchful eyes, scrutinizing their every move. Arabella retreated to her chambers, but rest eluded her. Ashby's gaze, filled with menacing promises, lingered in her mind. Later that night, a soft knock on her door startled her. She opened it to find Thomas, his serious expression lit by the flickering glow of a candelabra. "May I come in?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. Thomas closed the door behind him, his face grave. "There's something you need to know," he began, hesitating. Arabella crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly. "I'm listening." Thomas walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was tinged with anger and regret. "Benedict, he came to me a few months ago. He was desperate, drowning in debt to Ashby and others like him. He asked me for help, and I refused." Arabella felt a chill run down her spine. "Why?" Thomas turned to her, his brown eyes glinting with guilt. "Because I knew he was involved in something dirty, something that could ruin this family. I thought letting him face the consequences of his actions was the better choice." She didn't know what to say. Thomas's confession was unexpected, but it made sense. He had always seemed burdened by more than just his brother's death. "So, you think Ashby killed him because of that?" she asked at last. Thomas hesitated before answering. "It's possible, but it's also possible someone else used the situation to their advantage." Arabella frowned. "Like Lady Vivian, perhaps?" "She seemed far too eager to see me accused." Thomas sighed. "Vivian has a knack for scheming, but accusing a family member is a risky move even for her." Silence fell between them again, though this time it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something about Thomas's presence that Arabella was beginning to find reassuring, despite his stubbornness. Finally, Thomas stepped closer, his voice softer. "Arabella, I know I haven't been particularly welcoming, but I want you to know that I'm on your side, no matter what happens." She looked at him in surprise, something tightening in her chest. For a moment, she saw more than the rigid, distrustful air of Greystone. She saw a man trying to balance duty and loyalty. "Thank you," she said simply, but with sincerity. Before either of them could say more, a knock at the door interrupted them. A servant entered, carrying an urgent message. "My lord, my lady, a messenger has arrived. He says it's about Lord Ashby." Arabella and Thomas exchanged a glance, and without hesitation, they followed the servant. In the main hall, a breathless messenger waited, his clothes dusty and his eyes wide. "Lord Ashby has been attacked," he announced bluntly. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Arabella blinked, struggling to absorb the words. "Attacked?" Thomas repeated, disbelief in his voice. The messenger nodded. "He's alive, but gravely injured. He only said one name before losing consciousness. Greystone Arabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The name was hers, and Thomas's. "It seems someone is trying to frame us," Thomas said quietly, his eyes fixed on the messenger. Arabella swallowed hard, the growing threat tightening around her. Whoever was behind this was clearly determined to destroy them. And now, the shadowy game had turned deadly. Arabella's heart pounded like a drum as she walked alongside Thomas down the long corridor leading to the mansion's study. The message about Lord Ashby's attack loomed over them like a dark cloud. Every step seemed to echo in their minds, a constant reminder of the escalating danger. "This is a setup," Thomas muttered, his jaw tight. "Whoever attacked Ashby is trying to put us at the center of it all." Arabella nodded but couldn't mask the unease tightening her chest. "But who could it be? You said Benedict had plenty of enemies, but this feels different. They're hunting us." In the study, Thomas poured 2 glasses of brandy, sliding one toward Arabella. She accepted it, the burn of the drink scorching her throat but offering a necessary, albeit false, warmth. "We need a list," Arabella said suddenly, surprising even herself. "A list of everyone who had a grudge against Benedict. Maybe we can find a pattern, something to explain what's happening." Thomas raised an eyebrow, looking genuinely impressed. Not a bad idea. They spent the next several hours combing through Benedict's papers and correspondence. Each document revealed new, unsettling truths, debts to creditors, dubious agreements, and a string of names that grew more menacing with every mention. Among the papers, one name stood out, Lady Vivian. Arabella froze, the parchment trembling in her hands. "Lady Vivian was involved in his dealings?" she asked, holding the document out to Thomas. Thomas scanned the paper, letting out a long, weary sigh. "It seems my cousin lent Benedict money in exchange for a share in one of his ventures. If she knew how risky they were..." Arabella didn't need him to finish. The motive was clear. Lady Vivian had everything to lose with Benedict's death, but just as much to gain if someone else bore the blame. "We need to confront her," Arabella said, already rising from her seat. "Not so fast." Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "Vivian is shrewd. If we confront her without proof, she'll destroy us in days." Frustration bubbled within Arabella, but she knew Thomas was right. They couldn't act rashly. Patience, something she rarely possessed, would have to be their greatest weapon. The next morning, Arabella was in the garden when a familiar figure approached. Lady Vivian, with her impeccable smile and sharp eyes, looked far more radiant than anyone should given the circumstances. "My dear Arabella, how are you holding up amidst all this tragedy?" Vivian asked, leaning in as if genuinely concerned. Arabella kept her face neutral, though every word from Vivian felt like a barbed insult. "I'm managing as best as I can, Lady Vivian. And you?" "Oh, me?" Vivian let out a light laugh. "Just doing my best to protect the family's honor, of course. It's not easy when such scandalous rumors begin to circulate." Arabella felt a chill run down her spine. "What rumors?" Vivian leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Why, about you and Thomas, of course. People are beginning to wonder if you might have benefited from Benedict's untimely demise. Curious, isn't it?" Arabella swallowed hard, but maintained her composure. "Only someone desperate would try to accuse us of something so absurd." Vivian arched an eyebrow, her smile never faltering. "Perhaps. But, my dear, in society, truth matters far less than perception." As Vivian walked away, Arabella hurried to find Thomas. She found him in the library, surrounded by piles of documents. He looked up sharply as she entered. "What is it?" he asked. Arabella recounted her conversation with Vivian, and Thomas's expression darkened. "She's planting doubts. That confirms it. Vivian is involved." "Then we need to act," Arabella insisted, sitting down beside him. "If we don't, she'll crush us." Before Thomas could respond, a servant entered the room, carrying a sealed envelope. "My lord, this just arrived. It was delivered by an unknown messenger." Thomas carefully opened the envelope, revealing a hastily written note. The words, though brief, struck like thunder. "The poison that killed Benedict was in the hands of the one who should have protected him most. Open your eyes, Lord Hawthorne, before it's too late." Arabella and Thomas exchanged a tense look. The message was cryptic but clear. The killer was closer than they had imagined. "This is a warning," Arabella said quietly. "Or a trap," Thomas countered, gripping the letter tightly. The noose was tightening, and the time to uncover the truth was slipping away. Every move they made had to be precise, for one misstep could cost far more than their reputations. It could cost their lives. The grand hall of Greystone Hall was bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers and adorned with winter blooms, an elegant facade that masked the simmering tension beneath. The ball, originally planned by Benedict before his death, now felt more like a stage for the schemes and secrets threatening to consume the family. Guests laughed and danced, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Arabella descended the grand staircase with practiced grace, though each step felt like navigating a minefield. She wore an elegant sky-blue gown borrowed from Lady Briarwood, her poise concealing the turmoil roiling within her. At the bottom of the stairs, Thomas waited, his expression as composed as ever, though the weight in his gaze betrayed the strain he carried. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Arabella nodded, though a knot tightened in her stomach. "As ready as I'll ever be." The plan was simple in theory, dangerous in execution. They would confront Lady Vivian during the ball, using the mysterious letter as bait. The note, tucked securely in Thomas's pocket, was their only advantage, but also a considerable risk. Lady Vivian was in her element, surrounded by a cluster of admirers and laughing as though nothing in the world could rattle her. When Arabella and Thomas approached, she raised a glass of wine and smiled. "Ah, Lord Hawthorne and Lady Greystone. What a delightful sight. I hope you're enjoying the evening despite everything." "We are," Thomas replied, his smile tight. "And you?" "Always," Vivian said, tilting her head coyly. "It's a relief to see that mourning hasn't entirely dampened the festive spirit of this house." Arabella held her gaze on Vivian, her silence unsettling enough that the other woman's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. "Is something the matter, my dear?" Vivian asked with feigned concern. "Not at all," Arabella replied smoothly, her tone razor-sharp. "Though it is fascinating how some people adapt so well to others' tragedies." Vivian blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Arabella's boldness. Before she could respond, Thomas intervened. "Lady Vivian, might we speak in private? There's something we need to discuss." Vivian hesitated, her smile never wavering. "Of course." They retreated to the library, away from the curious eyes of the other guests. Once the door was closed, Thomas turned to Vivian, his expression hardening. "No more games, Vivian. We know you were involved with Benedict in ways that went beyond familial bonds." Vivian crossed her arms, her smile finally fading. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Arabella stepped forward, adrenaline coursing through her. "We know about the loans. We know Benedict put his fortune and his reputation on the line. And we know someone was desperate enough to ensure he didn't survive." Vivian let out a bitter laugh. "You think it was me? That I poisoned Benedict? Please be more creative." Thomas pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to Vivian. "Recognize this?" Vivian scanned the letter quickly, her expression shifting to genuine surprise for a brief moment. "Who wrote this?" she asked, her voice lower, almost uneasy. "We were hoping you could tell us," Thomas replied. Vivian tossed the letter onto the table, her indignation giving way to something more dangerous. "You're focused on the wrong person. Benedict wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a fool either. He knew who he was dealing with, but he underestimated the people within this house." Arabella frowned, a chill running down her spine. "What do you mean by that?" Vivian met her gaze, her voice heavy with warning. "I'm saying that someone you trust is playing against you." Before she could elaborate, a scream echoed from the ballroom. The three exchanged alarmed glances before rushing back to the grand hall. At the center of the commotion stood Lord Ashby, limping and visibly enraged. "You think you can escape this?" he bellowed, pointing accusingly at Thomas and Arabella. "You think you can challenge men like me without consequences?" Guests whispered nervously, the tension in the room palpable. Thomas stepped forward, raising his voice to command the room's attention. "Are you accusing us of something, Lord Ashby? If so, I suggest you provide proof to back your claims." Ashby raised his hand, revealing a small crystal bottle, eerily similar to the one found on the day of Benedict's death. "This was delivered to me tonight with a note claiming it was in Lady Greystone's possession," he declared. Arabella felt the weight of every gaze fall on her. Before she could respond, Vivian's voice rang out clear and decisive. "This is a farce." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Vivian. She stepped forward, snatching the bottle from Ashby's hand and holding it aloft. "I don't like Arabella, but even she isn't foolish enough to let something like this fall into the wrong hands," Vivian said, her commanding presence dominating the room. "Ashby, stop this theater and admit you're trying to manipulate us all." Ashby sputtered in protest, but Vivian, with her sharp wit and unyielding poise, quickly silenced him. "Benedict died because he was too weak to handle the enemies he made," Vivian continued, her voice cold and precise. "And if Ashby is here trying to frame Lady Greystone, it's because he has something to hide." The room erupted into chaos, guests whispering and speculating. Arabella and Thomas exchanged a look, their earlier suspicions confirmed. Vivian had done something unexpected. She had deflected the scrutiny from Arabella. But the question lingered. Why would someone so willing to undermine Arabella suddenly choose to protect her? The ball had transformed into a battlefield, and the truth, now within reach, felt like a weapon no one knew how to wield. Epilogue: a future of truths and promises. The morning after the ball dawned with a clear sky and a deceptive calmness over Greystone Hall. The revelations of the previous night still hung in the air like a heavy shroud, but one truth had emerged. Benedict's death had been a calculated act, and the true culprit was still among them. Arabella woke early, a mixture of relief and exhaustion coursing through her. After the confrontation with Lord Ashby and Lady Vivian's unexpected defense, things were far from resolved, but the path to the truth was becoming clearer. As she fixed her hair before the mirror, a soft knock at the door interrupted her. "Come in," she called, expecting a servant, but it was Thomas. He looked different in the morning light, less rigid, more vulnerable. In his hands was a folded piece of paper, the same letter Lord Ashby had brandished at the ball. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Arabella gestured to the chair by the window, but he didn't sit. Instead, he began pacing the room, his eyes fixed on the letter. "I spent the night trying to figure out who could have written this," he began, his voice heavy with determination. "And I think I finally know." Arabella leaned forward, curiosity burning in her eyes. "Who?" Thomas hesitated, as though the name was hard to say. It wasn't Vivian, and it wasn't Ashby. The handwriting. It's Benedict's. The room fell silent. Arabella felt the air rush from her lungs. "How is that possible?" she finally asked, her voice low. "Benedict knew he was in danger," Thomas explained, guilt evident in his tone. He wrote this letter and left it with Ashby as a form of protection. He thought that if anything happened, it would expose his enemies. Arabella stood, anger and relief warring within her. Then why did Ashby bring it to the ball? Because he wanted to use it against us, Thomas replied. But he didn't anticipate Vivian challenging him. Arabella crossed her arms, a nagging thought persisting. That still doesn't explain who killed Benedict. Thomas nodded. No, it doesn't. But it gives us a new direction. Later that morning, Thomas called a meeting with Lady Vivian and Lord Ashby. The atmosphere in the library was thick with distrust and hostility, but Thomas wasted no time. We have a new piece of this puzzle, he began, placing the letter on the table. And it leads to an inconvenient truth. Benedict knew he was surrounded by enemies, and he knew he couldn't trust anyone. Ashby leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And what does that prove? It proves he left a trap, Arabella said, her voice surprisingly firm. And now it's up to us to figure out who tried to benefit from it. Vivian arched an eyebrow but remained silent. The discussion dragged on for hours, each detail scrutinized, each suspicion debated. By the end, one thing was clear. Someone within Greystone Hall, perhaps a servant or even another family member, had more to gain from Benedict's death than they had imagined. That evening, as the mansion fell into an uneasy silence, Arabella and Thomas walked together through the gardens. "Do you think we'll solve this?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he replied, his gaze steady and intense. "Because now we're a team." Arabella smiled, a comforting warmth spreading through her. Though Benedict's secrets still cast long shadows over them, she realized she had found something precious in Thomas, a partnership rooted in respect and perhaps something deeper. As the moon bathed the gardens of Greystone in its silvery glow, Arabella felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered, but with Thomas by her side, she knew she could face anything. And so, with secrets still lurking and unspoken promises between them, Arabella and Thomas braced themselves for what lay ahead, together. If you're captivated by tales of intrigue, unexpected romance, and characters who make you laugh and swoon, check out the video, Duke is Mistaken on a Blind Date, by a poor girl who never knew his identity and falls in love. In this enchanting story, a young woman falls for a mysterious man, unaware he's a duke in disguise. The confusion, of course, is just the beginning. Will they overcome their world's differences and discover what truly matters? And speaking of love with hidden secrets, what would you do if the person you fell for had a secret as grand as a noble title? If you love lighthearted, dramatic stories with happy endings, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to see more enchanting tales like this one. Comment below with "The Secret of True Love" if this story resonated with you. Also, if you're a fan of Regency-era books, check out the pinned comment for a list of my top recommendations. You won't want to miss it.